Hey everyone, and welcome not to Animal Notebook. I am so excited for today's explainer because we're looking at one of the absolute most iconic creatures to ever walk the earth. We're calling this one the woolly mammoth, a giant frozen in time. So let's just jump right in and see what the data actually tells us about this legendary Ice Age heavyweight.
Okay, I want you to picture this for a second. You're standing in the middle of a totally freezing, windswept, starlit winter landscape. It is brutally cold. And to get your breakfast, you have to literally sweep away deep, hard-packed snow using 14-foot curved tusks. Crazy, right? But that was just everyday life for the woolly mammoth on the frigid Mammoth steppe. It's a pretty wild thought, but it perfectly captures both the harshness of their world and just how incredibly resilient they were.
All right, so here's our game plan for today. We've got a 6-part journey. We'll start with Meet the Ice Age Giant, then Surviving the Mammoth Steppe, and the Extinction Mystery. After that, we'll get into Frozen Clues in Permafrost, a mammoth genetic reboot, and finally, we'll wrap up with the top 4 mammoth FAQs. So, let's kick things off with Part 1, Meet the Ice Age Giant, Anatomy of a Megafauna.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how completely opposite a mammoth's body was compared to, say, a modern African elephant. Being part of the megafauna, which is just the scientific term for the giant animals of the Pleistocene epoch, meant they had to be highly specialized to survive. For starters, the woolly mammoth had super small ears and a really short tail. Why? To minimize heat loss and prevent frostbite. African elephants, on the other hand, use their massive ears to dump heat. Mammoths also rocks this thick, double-layered coat. We're talking dark guard hairs up to 3 feet long over a super dense wool undercoat. Oh, and that high dome skull? That is totally different from the flatter skull of an elephant today.
And you know, that high skull hump wasn't just for show. It actually acted as a critical fat reserve. In fact, underneath all that shaggy fur, these guys packed up to 4 inches, or about 10 centimeters of subcutaneous fat. Add in some highly specialized cold-adapted hemoglobin in their blood, and you've basically got a permanent biological winter parka. It was absolutely essential for surviving those brutal freezing winters. Moving right along to Section 2, Surviving the Mammoth Steppe. Diet and habitat. So where did they actually live? They roamed what we call the Mammoth Steppe. This was a vast, cold, dry grassland stretching all the way across northern Eurasia and into North America. And yeah, they actually crossed over using the Bering Land Bridge. At their peak, they had one of the most expansive ranges of any Ice Age mammal, leaving their giant padded footprints everywhere from Siberia and Europe all the way to Alaska and northern Canada. But here's the thing. Keeping a 4 to 6 ton body moving in a freezing environment requires a ridiculous amount of calories. These giant herbivores were eating an astounding 180 to 400 pounds of vegetation every single day. Grasses, sedges, shrubs, you name it. And remember those massive 14-foot curved tusks I mentioned earlier? They used those ingenious tools essentially as biological snowplows, literally scraping away the snow and breaking the ice just to get to the frozen food buried underneath. Which brings us to Section 3, the Extinction Mystery. Why did they disappear? The timeline of their extinction is actually a really complex puzzle. Most mainland populations vanished around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age. But amazingly, isolated groups survived on islands way after the mainland herds were gone. A population on St. Paul Island miraculously held out until about 5,600 years ago. And their absolute final stand? That took place on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, where a tiny group survived until just 4,000 years ago.
So what actually caused this collapse? Well, it's still heavily debated in the scientific community, but the data points to a few main drivers. First, rapid climate change. As temperatures warmed, their dry steppe habitat shrank, turning into forests and wetlands. Then there's the overkill hypothesis, which suggests that highly skilled human hunters moved into their territories and accelerated their decline. And finally, genetic bottlenecks. As their numbers dwindled and they got stuck on these isolated islands, their gene pool shrank dangerously, making them super vulnerable to disease. It was likely a tragic combination of all these factors that ultimately brought the giants down.
All right, Section 4, Frozen Clues in Permafrost, Unearthing the Past.
Now, I want to pose a question directly to you. How do we actually know all these specific details about a species that vanished thousands of years ago? How do we know they had exactly 4 inches of fat, or what they ate for breakfast? Well, the crucial point is that they lived in environments with permafrost. The freezing Siberian mud essentially acted like a giant freezer, fossilizing them perfectly and preserving entire carcasses,
Skin, hair, internal organs, the whole shebang. We've found some unbelievable specimens, like Luba, a 42,000-year-old female calf discovered in 2007 with her stomach contents perfectly intact. We literally found her mother's milk and grass still inside. Then there's Dima, a frozen male calf found in 1977, and Yucca, a 10,000-year-old specimen. Thanks to the permafrost, humanity has essentially taken these fascinating frozen animals and turned them into the most magnificent biological archaeology.
Next up, Section 5. A Mammoth Genetic Reboot? The Science of De-extinction. Okay, so humanity looked at extinction and essentially decided the sequel deserved a reboot. Modern geneticists, specifically a company called Colossal Biosciences, are attempting the cutting-edge science of de-extinction. Because we have the full mammoth genome, which was sequenced back in 2015, scientists have pinpointed the exact genes for cold resistance, hair growth, and fat storage. The goal now? Use CRISPR, a super precise gene editing tool, to splice those mammoth traits into the cells of an Asian elephant. They're basically trying to create a cold-adapted elephant hybrid. It is an ongoing, heavily debated, but absolutely fascinating endeavor.
And finally, Section 6, Top 4 Mammoth FAQs, answering your biggest questions. Let's do a rapid-fire Q&A to wrap this up. Let's kick things off with question 1. What is the woolly mammoth's closest living relative? You might look at an African elephant and just assume that's the one, right? Well, actually, it is the Asian elephant. The two species share an incredible 99.6% of their DNA. The mammoth lineage and the Asian elephant lineage diverged from a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago.
Moving on to question 2, which tackles a really common misconception. Were woolly mammoths the largest mammoths to ever live? Because we constantly call them giants, it's super easy to assume they were the absolute biggest.
But the answer is no. They actually evolved from the much, much larger steppe mammoth. Woolly mammoths were roughly the same height as modern African elephants, standing about 9 to 11 feet tall at the shoulder. So large, absolutely, but nowhere near the biggest on their family tree.
Okay, question 3. Did early human hunt woolly mammoths? We know they coexisted during the Pleistocene, but did they actually interact?
Yes, for sure. Archaeological evidence clearly shows that early humans hunted them for food and utilized those massive ivory tusks and bones for tools, art, and even as building materials for shelters. There are cave paintings all across Europe depicting them, and famous artifacts like the Venus of Hall Fells were carved directly out of mammoth ivory.
And that brings us to question 4, which leaves us with a really profound thought regarding those de-extinction efforts we discussed. Even if we can bring the mammoth back to the steppe, should we? It's a hugely complex scientific frontier. We have to weigh habitat availability, ecological impact, and of course, animal welfare. It's a conversation happening right now, without any easy answers. So what do you think? Let that sit with you for a bit as you reflect on this incredible giant frozen in time. Thank you so much for joining me on Animal Notebook today, and keep exploring.